So welcome everyone to today's presentation by Amanda Miller. Amanda will be talking to us about targeted grazing and wildlife risk reduction. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that those of us that are in this room are on the unceded traditional territory of the Leditene First Nation. And since some of us are connecting virtually, let us also acknowledge the indigenous people of all the lands that we are on today. Just to give a brief introduction of Amanda Miller. Amanda is the owner and founder of Palus Rangeland Consulting. Amanda has a master's degree in rangeland and wildlife resources from University of Alberta and has been a professional agrologist since 2016. As a rangeland specialist for the government of Alberta from 2013 to 2019, Amanda has worked to develop ecological tools, apply research and policy solutions to address emerging rangeland issues. Amanda is passionate about rangeland stewardship and conservation with keen interest in providing ecological tools and strategies for long-term sustainable land management. At this point, I'll kind of leave the floor to Amanda to take us through her presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the introduction. So I'm here today to talk to you about a targeted grazing project, primarily to reduce wildfire risk. That was done mostly in partnership with the BC Cattlemen's Association. Just a little bit of an overview. I want to take a step back and talk about the natural disturbance regimes and how they interact with fire risk within our current context, the BC Cattlemen's Association targeted pilot, and then we'll have some questions. So natural disturbance regimes and fire risk. This is going to be a little bit of background information that might not seem pertinent at first, but I swear it's going to make sense. So within the context of interior BC, our rangeland ecosystems, so our forested lands and our grasslands, they are actually incredibly dynamic and ever-changing ecosystems. They developed under this historic disturbance regime that was dominated by two main factors, wildfire and grazing. As well as a number of different factors too that played smaller roles, such as, drought, the impact of predators and predation on ungulate movement, subsequently impacting grazing disturbance, decomposition, floods, wind erosion, like all these different factors, they came together and they're the reason why our ecosystems are the way that they are and why they respond to disturbance the way that they do. So fire being one of the main ones. There's an historic fire regime that's associated with interior BC, and actually the entirety of our country has historic fire regimes. So within the context of interior BC, both natural and anthropogenic fires really shaped our landscape. So wildfire starts from natural sources such as lightning occurred, but we also have to acknowledge that there was a huge presence of wildfire or of fire that was used as a management tool by Indigenous people. And this was used for wildlife management for millennia. And this resulted within the context of interior BC, we had mixed severity fire regimes. So we have these stand maintaining fires, low intensity, that occurred in grasslands and more open forested systems. And then we also had these periodic stand replacing fires where a forest would completely burn to the ground and you sort of start off at your pioneer stage again. And this resulted in a very diverse species composition across these ecosystems, as well as diverse age classes across our forests. So they weren't all just one age and one species across them. And then the other key piece is our historic grazing regime and its impact on plant ecology. So within interior BC, during the summer, our large grazing animals, our ungulates, such as, elk, deer, etc., they tend to move up in elevation following spring green up as it occurs, from our low elevation grassland, valley bottoms up towards higher elevation areas. And then in winter, we see the opposite, where as it starts to get colder and snowier in those higher elevations, ungulates tend to come down and they return to our low elevation grasslands and open forests, because these areas had, of course, lower snow loads, and then they also had grasses that were present that had higher crude protein content once they went dormant and senesce. So, they tend to cure on the stem and retain this crude protein, which is an excellent resource for ungulates during the winter. And so this is our critical winter range for ungulates. And why I'm talking about this is that it's really important to realize and understand that our rangelands co-evolved with this pattern of grazing disturbance, in addition to that fire disturbance as well. So what does this have to do with ecosystem composition? Well, as I've said, native ecosystems actually adapted to these disturbance factors. And in fact, they require them to remain healthy and functional. A lot of times we think about conservation, we want to take an area and fence it off and not have any disturbance occur within it because we think that we're preserving it. But in reality, we actually do need disturbance to remain healthy. And we found that maximum diversity within these types of ecosystems that evolved with these different disturbance factors, maximum diversity is found where we have an intermediate amount of disturbance. So you can see in this graph below, if we remove our environmental stressors, we start to be dominated by a few number of competitive species. If we have a large number of like an increased high level of environmental stress, like high levels of environmental disturbance, then we decrease our number of species to only species that are resistant to these types of disturbance factors. But when we're in the middle, we find that there's an intermediate amount of disturbance, and that provides habitat niches for the largest amount of species that can be found. So there's value in having an intermediate amount of disturbance. So what does this have to do with forests and grazing and all these things? So we tend to think of forest succession as being this very linear path where, you have something occur and you're down at the bottom, you have all these pioneer species, and we move forward, and we're always wanting to go towards this climax forest situation where we've got these, big old trees and everything like that. Well, because of the evolution of our ecosystems in interior British Columbia and across other parts of the province too, this is actually not true. And we don't always want to have all of our forests always at this late stage climax situation, because it doesn't provide all the habitat niches, and it's just not the way that the ecosystem evolved. So patchiness is actually key to maintaining these ecosystems. Because this historic disturbance regimes of fire and grazing were non-uniform, our different wildlife species also evolved to have these different habitat requirements. So our habitat preferences for all of our wildlife that are found in British Columbia range from heavily to lightly disturbed types of ecosystems. And providing a mosaic of disturbance levels actually provides habitat for the largest suite of wildlife. So, on this slide here, we have our caribou up top. These guys really like and need old growth forests. So they need those areas of forest that have reached that climax old growth stage. And then we have a fisher in the middle, and this guy needs old growth trees with large cavities to help rear their young. But they hunt in early to late xeral forests that have lots of structural diversity. So they need to have a mosaic of successional stages of forests across the land for them to fulfill all the different parts of their life cycle. And then we see bighorn on the bottom there. And so bighorn, they do not want any trees or anything near them. They want open grasslands with more than 60% horizontal visibility and have escape terrain. So they'll absolutely avoid forested areas and other dense habitat. So if we have a diversity of different types of ecosystems that are a resultant of a diversity of different types of disturbance regimes, then we provide habitat for all these animals. If we remove disturbance from the landscape, then we start to see these types of the amount and availability of these different types of ecosystems that provide the habitat niches disappear. And we move towards that trajectory of having only those large old growth climax forests. And then another key piece of why this is important is if we have a mosaic of different types of forests and ecosystems across the landscape, wildfire cannot move as quickly or at as high a severity as it can through something that is even aged and dense stands. And so this is just providing a little bit more of a context around that. So in the top right-hand corner, this is a dense forest. It provides some habitat to some types of animals. And then, we have different types of habitat that a large suite of animals use, early cereal situations where bears have berries to eat, aspen forests that have lots of forage and still hiding places for deer, and then open grassland. So we want to maintain this diversity of habitat across our province. So as I said before, removing disturbance from these disturbance-mediated ecosystems does have negative impacts. And one of the big ones that has occurred over the last 100 years is fire suppression. So it's caused significant changes to our landscape and the wildlife habitat associated with it. And not only that, but it increases the risk of large-scale, severe stand-destroying fires when we have these dense forests that are even-aged and generally tend to be dominated by one or two species. And that's when we get situations such as this, where fire can move a lot more easily and at a higher rate of severity than it would in cases where there is a mosaic and there's heterogeneity across this landscape that could break up the fire. And just to highlight this is a picture from up in the Chilcotin. And so it's a good way of comparing what things look like, about 100 years ago. So up on the top there, you see there's a lot more open areas, and then the fire suppression over the last 100 years kind of has resulted in increased forest encroachment into these areas in the bottom photo. So shifting management paradigms. So ecosystem-based management tends to see disturbance as a natural ecosystem process and likes to mimic the historic rhythms and patterns of disturbance to create these different types of ecosystem across our land base. And so then we can have things such as grassland, some open grassland areas that are maintained as such, some patches of dense forest, early cereal forests, shrublands, different types of species, deciduous forests mixed in as well. And so one of the values relative to fire that comes from this is that in a fire suppressed forest, you have a higher level of severity that can come from your fires because it's densely ingrown and there's lots of fuel, so your severity is going to be a bit higher. When we move towards looking at ecologically managed forests that are managed more with some of these different ecosystem-based functions in mind, we have a forest that's more resilient to disturbance and potentially will have less severity associated with any fires that run through it. And so that's kind of outlined in this slide here. So, okay, that was, I think, hopefully gives you an idea of why disturbance and, there's a need to have these types of these different uses on the landscape. So we'll talk about the BC Cattlemen's Association Targeted Grazing Pilot, which I've been a researcher on for the past 3 years. So project history. Well, as everyone's aware, the 2017-18 fires were very severe. They were large in scale and scope. 2017, there was 1.2 million hectares burned, 65,000 people evacuated, and just under $650 million in fire suppression costs. 2018 was pretty darn bad too. Just a little bit more in hectares were burned, 1.3 million. 2,200 people were evacuated, and $615 million in fire suppression costs. And then 2021 was also an unpleasant fire year where there was just under 1 million hectares burned and $565 million of fire suppression costs. So there have been a lot of fires that we're looking for ways to proactively manage. So what came out of those two very difficult fire years, 2017-18, was that the value of agricultural practices, specifically grazing, were apparent in changing fire behavior by helping to slow, turn, or stop fires. And so these were considered agricultural fire breaks, for a colloquial term. And after seeing this on the landscape, a lot of these fires burned through ranch lands. The BC Cattlemen's Association partnered with the province and with several ranchers to develop a pilot program that is intended to investigate the wildfire risk reduction values through targeted grazing as a practice. And targeted grazing within the context of this type of work is used to reduce or break up fine fuel loads and subsequent wildfire risk next to our communities, utilities, and transportation corridors. So targeted grazing might be a term you've heard before, potentially not. But what it is the use of a specified kind of livestock at a determined season, duration, and intensity to accomplish a defined vegetation goal or landscape goal. And so within the context of wildfire risk reduction, most of our fuel management practices are really focused on the trees, because that's where we have, our high levels of severity, like crown fires, the big scary ones that I showed pictures of. So our fuel management projects are really focused on that. And they look at removing trees, decreasing the number of trees per hectare, changing the species of trees, and or removing or pruning the understory. So that's in an attempt to create those more resilient forests that I've discussed previously. So, but one outcome of that is that we have an increase in herbaceous material after the overstory has been opened up. We get a big flush of things like grasses and shrubs. Grasses specifically are quite volatile and easily ignited type of fuel. I think that most people listening have probably tried to make fire before. You need tinder. Dried grass is one of the best types of tinder. So the goal of this project was to really address that fine fuel load that comes from these wildfire risk reduction practices that open up the canopy. So we want to reduce those fine fuel loads and break up the fuel continuity while still ensuring that our other key important values are not negatively impacted. And that includes things like ecological integrity, biodiversity values, etc. And so we did that within the context, because this is all on Crown land, we did that within the context of following range use plan goals and objectives around stubble height and forage use levels, ensuring that those were not exceeded as part of this project. All right, so that's why this project came to be. Let's talk about the pilot sites and our experimental design. So we established 4 sites in 2020, 1 in Peachland, 1 in Summerland, and 2 in Cranbrook. And then additionally, another site was established in Kelowna in 2022. So monitoring occurs in an area of interest, which is within 2 kilometers of community infrastructure, because this distance is used province-wide for BC Wildfire Service for wildfire prevention planning around communities. And the effects of our grazing treatment may extend up to 2 kilometers, depending on our field types, our topography, and our cattle management challenges. And our intensive data collection occurred within 400 meters of infrastructure, because that's kind of the ember spotting distance that the BC Wildfire Service has communicated with us. So, if we can reduce the amount of embers that can spot out of that area, that's where we really want to focus our efforts on. Our monitoring for this project was composed of two main monitoring components. So the first is intensive monitoring, which was once a season at permanent macro plots within that 400-meter boundary. And then our extensive monitoring occurred every 2 weeks during the grazing treatment, and that was across the larger 2-kilometer boundary. A little bit more information on that. Our extensive was intended to provide broad coverage of the pilot site and to allow for adaptive management during the treatment, just in case there were any issues with potentially degradation or any other management changes that needed to be addressed quite quickly. So we had that feedback loop. And this included reviewing, going to each of these plots. So that's outlined in the photo there. We would record our plant species, leading plant species height, estimated cover, the estimated grazing use, characterize the fuel continuity. We did riparian health assessments whenever there were riparian areas, and we addressed, reviewed plot attributes such as like slope, aspect, etc. So our intensive design was where we had our intensive monitoring that occurred after grazing, right after the grazing treatment was applied. And this was to provide quantitative data that could be used for statistical inferences. And it occurred on 3 small randomly selected macro plot areas that were within the 400-meter boundary. And we reviewed and recorded a slew of variables at these different, at these macro plots. So I think there were 16 different variables, everything from biomass, fuel moisture content, litter, substrate cover, plant community composition, conifer regeneration, different ecological factors such as soil movement, bare soil, biological soil crusts, etc. So there's a lot of intensive data gathering. And this is just one of our pilot sites. This is Cranbrook East. And so you can see there in orange, there are those 3 macro plot site locations within that 400-meter boundary to the community. And this is what it looked like. So we had it split into 5 different quadrants where we had biomass, and then in the middle where we had biomass measurements and forage cages to provide a graze versus non-graze comparison. And then we also within the middle had 5 different transects where we tracked the plant community composition over the duration of the study. So one key thing around targeted grazing is the stocking rates that are applied. And we have conventional grazing, and then within the context of targeted grazing, we usually use higher densities of animals to target these areas. So across our different pilot sites, we were able to use the high density, targeted grazing type of application for the majority of the pilot sites for the majority of the year. For our Peachland site, we weren't able to for the first 2 years just due to delays in getting infrastructure in place, because of course this does require enhanced infrastructure such as fencing to contain the cattle to the target area. But we were able to achieve that in the final year of the study. And then in the Summerland site, we were able to achieve it for the final 2 years of the study. So we have 2 good years of data there. So overall, these are our biomass results. So that's where we compare the biomass reduction between our non-graze controls in forage cages and our grazed samples. And so this ranged from a 25% reduction in biomass at our Cranbrook West site up to a 62% reduction in biomass at our Summerland site. And this is for the final year of the treatments. And so the whole amount removed ranged from 165 kilograms per hectare at Cranbrook East to 741 kilograms per hectare at the Summerland site of biomass that was removed. And of course, we all know, grazing is going to obviously reduce biomass, but we of course had to measure that as a component of this project. So yes, we can definitively say now that the cattle will reduce the amount of grass there. Stubble height is the height of the grass, which has implications on things such as flame length when we're talking about fire behavior. And so we found within our project that the targeted grazing treatment reduced the stubble height across all of our pilot sites effectively, except for the Cranbrook West pilot site, which was kind of strange because we were implementing high density stocking there. The percentage reduction ranged from 25% at Peachland on rough fescue grass up to 50% at Summerland found on blue bunch wheatgrass. And the absolute values of height removed range from 10 centimeters at Peachland, again on rough fescue, up to 20 centimeters at the Summerland site on blue bunch wheatgrass. But all in all, we found that there was largely a reduction in stubble height from the grazing treatments, as was expected. So this is just, I think this is at the Cranbrook East site, and that's just a little way of showing, yep, the cattle went in and did their job. So of course, it's all good and well and good to know that we were able to reduce the fuel load by reducing the amount of biomass and the height of it. But what happened to ecosystem health, because it is, of course, on Crown Range specifically, it is a value that we need to maintain. So we monitored range health over all 3 years at the pilot sites and found that targeted grazing was compatible with maintaining our ecosystem health and function at all of our pilot sites, with the exception of our Summerland site. And in the last year of the study, we found that Summerland had shown reduction in range health compared to the first year's sampled. So that's down at the bottom there, our Summerland site. You can see it went from properly functioning condition with one macro plot noted at slightly at risk. And then in the final year of the study, they were all rated at moderately at risk. So that raises a bit of a red flag for us. Another key indicator of ecosystem health is the amount of exposed soil. So we found in tracking with range health, we found that exposed soil did not increase from the grazing treatment, except for at the Summerland site, which did see significant increases in exposed soil from the grazing treatment. And it also, and that's within year for 2020. And then we also found that in our plant community transects, where we're tracking over years, we found that exposed soil did not increase over time for those annual tracking, except for, again, at the Summerland site, which did see an increase of 61% from 2020 to 2022 in bare soil. And so I believe that this is largely just because of the difference in the types of communities. So the Summerland site is on the left-hand side of your screen. It's a low elevation bunch grassland. And then the other types of sites, so the Peachland, Cranbrook, Southeast Kelowna, etc., those sites are all sort of forested and they have a pine grass understory. And pine grass is a rhizomatous grass. Rhizomatous grasses are generally more resilient to grazing pressure during the growing season than our low elevation grasslands. Grass species such as blue bunch wheatgrass and rock fescue, which, you know, if we think back to the disturbance regime of our province, animals would move up in elevation and then come back. So they would be grazing these generally during the dormant season, or low elevation grasslands. So that's likely why we saw that difference. But it's a key takeaway from this project is that targeted grazing may not be compatible within every type of ecosystem. So that's great. We were able to reduce biomass. We know maybe it's more appropriate in some ecosystems than others. We can take that and move forward with it. But what were the impacts on wildfire behavior? So to fully quantify that, we had to go and use some novel wildfire modeling approaches because our Canadian wildfire modeling does not fully address all the different layers of complexity associated with surface fires and grass-dominated fires. So we used a model called Behave Plus out of the United States, and we were able to effectively model the fire behavior of these different grassland ecosystems and see what the difference in the biomass did to the different types of fire behavior indicators. And so we found that because targeted grazing reduced the amount of fine fuel and heights and created gaps in our fuel, the modeling showed that the grazing treatment actually reduced the wildfire rate of spread, intensity, and flame length. And so this is for the Summerland site, which again had the greatest reduction in biomass. And so we saw a pretty substantial reduction in those different indicators. The grazing treatment reduced our rate of spread, the intensity, and reduced the flame length, all of which are important when we're thinking about actioning these types of fires. So there are communities in BC in the wildland urban interface that are at a very high risk of wildfire damage. And I live in the North Okanagan. In 2021, we had the White Rock Lake fire, which was very frightening. And, you know, we continue to have these fires that are encroaching into the wildland urban interface. So targeted grazing can be utilized within these areas as a complement to other proactive integrated wildfire management strategies. So we can have it as a component of having thinning and those treatments for the overstory, and along with other types of activities such as prescribed burns. These can all be complementary tools to help proactively manage our wildfire risk. Because as you can see on the map, anywhere that's red has a high degree of threat. And so we want to be searching for ways to mitigate that threat rather than always relying on reactive management that can be incredibly costly, as was discussed at the beginning of this part of the presentation. So this is just a little bit of an overview. There are some policy considerations that can go along with this. It would be great to integrate grazing for fine fuel management into forestry type situations and our wildfire risk reduction forest treatments. If we can integrate fine fuel management as a consideration of other wildfire management strategies, that would be very valuable as well. And then we could also, from an agricultural perspective, have supporting grazing in these wildland urban interface areas helps enhance community protection. And then it also, supports some of our local BC food as well by providing beef. Grazing management, like if we could use grazing animals as cost-effective method of reducing fine fuels, there's value in that. And we can support our forestry objectives while still integrating grazing. And then that also helps reduce wildfire hazard by having annual management of our volatile fine fuels, and reducing wildfires helps support a stable timber industry with resources that aren't burnt up, in these large scale intense fires. So basically the fire behavior outcomes that we're after, that this could be a complementary piece of, are discontinuous fuels and less biomass to reduce fire intensity, rate of spread, and frequency. So in summary here, targeted grazing, we believe this research has shown, can be an effective tool to help remove fine fuel and reduce severe wildfire behavior. This study has shown that our intensive management can be used to achieve effective and consistent removal of fine fuel, but intensive targeted grazing may not be appropriate across all ecosystems and locations. So detailed site assessments should be completed to develop these targeted grazing prescriptions, and this should include consideration of things such as plant community resilience to annual grazing. We found that having high levels of grazing in low elevation bunchgrass ecosystems isn't conducive to maintaining their health. However, it had no negative impacts in some of these more resilient systems that were pine grass dominated. One key piece is occurrence of toxic plants that needs to be addressed. We unfortunately last year did lose a number of calves, 3 of them at one of our grazing treatments because of larkspur. So we need to consider that. The abundance of invasive plants. Would a targeted grazing treatment potentially spread them? That's not something we want to do. Are there culturally significant plants or rare plants? We tracked those as part of our larger project as well, in partnership with First Nations partners. And then also we have to consider, are there species at risk present across these potential site areas? And would grazing have negative impacts on their habitat or grazing at the levels that we are intending to? So in summary, it is a good potential tool to use as part of proactive management of fine fuels and wildfire risk. What we're really looking to do is kind of walk the fence line from this. We don't want to have something like on the inside of the fence where there's a high level of fuel and a potential fire hazard. But we also don't want to graze to the extent that we have an unhealthy ecosystem. So it's a difficult balancing act. So in summary, just to pull it all together, understanding the evolutionary history of ecosystems is very important, not just within the context of targeted grazing, but for any type of land and resource management. Understanding what drives these ecosystems allows us to make informed management decisions that can enhance the resiliency of them for years to come. And also within the context of wildfire, management decisions that increase the resiliency of landscapes are beneficial to wildfire management, watersheds, wildlife, and a whole suite of things. So it's all interconnected, and that's why it's important to know where you come from to figure out where you want to go. Just some quick acknowledgements before we move into questions. Funding support for this project was provided through the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, the BC Ministry of Forests, and the BC Wildfire Service. I would like to send special thanks to Reg Newman, our lead researcher, Shauna Larad, the range officer for the Rocky Mountain District, Kyra Witt, range officer for the Okanagan-Shuswap District, and Rob Dinwiddie, who is the former and now retired range officer for that district, as well as our incredible ranching partners, Jordy Thibault, Keith Manders, and Dave Casorso, Harvey Bombardier, and Colin Thompson, who were all excellent volunteers who participate in this project. And I think, should I quit sharing my screen now?
Yeah, sure. And we have a.
All right.
Not sure, Amanda, if you can read the Q&A questions, but we'll read them out anyway. Are you able to see the Q&A questions yourself so you can read them? Yeah, okay, yeah. Good. I'm not sure if the other folks online, there's about 17 folks who are online besides us, if they can read them or not, but.
Okay, perfect.
Maybe I'll.
So why was soil cover at the Summerland site reduced in the absence of grazing? Part of that was because 2021 we had a drought that reduced soil, or that reduced plant cover regardless of whether or not there was any sort of disturbance on it. And then the second question, did you do fire modeling at the other sites? Yes, we did. And it reduced all those indicators of wildfire behavior and severity at all the different sites. But Summerland saw the biggest reduction, so it was the easiest one to visualize. I didn't want to have like 5 or 6 different ones up anyway. Did you see any increase in invasive species such as cheatgrass or Dalmatian toadflax in response to heavy grazing? So it's not heavy grazing. We're still meeting our required stocking rates under the Crown range use plans. It's just that it occurs at a shorter period of time and with more higher animal numbers. But to your question, Dalmatian, you know what? It was really interesting because that you mentioned Dalmatian toadflax. So at the Summerland site, the targeted grazing treatment actually removed Dalmatian toadflax. So when we did our first year of monitoring, there was Dalmatian toadflax present both at our extensive monitoring sites and at our intensive monitoring sites, so along those transects that were very detailed, tracked in a very detailed way. And the grazing pressure actually took out the Dalmatian toadflax. I think because it is kind of a bit more of a succulent type of a form. And so the cattle did target it as part of that treatment. So that was actually reduced. Cheatgrass was reduced the Summerland site, it was reduced between 2020 to 2021. And then in 2022, I think there was a bit of an overachievement on the grazing side. And so there was a slight increase in our cheatgrass cover. And then at other sites, we actually had 0 invasives at our Cranbrook sites, which was a testament to how great the managers are. So there wasn't any impact, there wasn't any change on those sites. No invasives were introduced. And then our Southeast Kelowna site has, I think, because it's heavily used for recreation, it has, I think, the most invasive species of anywhere I've ever seen. But there was no change with the grazing treatment to the amount of invasive species. And then I see, would you still recommend targeted grazing on grassland sites, or is it better in forested sites? I would say it's probably a more compatible land use with some of those forested sites that have rhizomatous grass species, but it would still definitely be appropriate in grasslands. It just has to be managed with, I would say, our managers were excellent and they were out there on a daily basis, but it can happen, overachievement can happen quite quickly. And then within the context of grasslands specifically, I would say it would definitely be very valuable and easy to implement on potentially agronomic types of grasslands. So crested wheatgrass fields, it would be perfectly suited for that, or Kentucky bluegrass type of pastures as well. Is there any thought to running side-by-side trials of areas with prescribed fire? Say prescribed fire treating a leaf polygon and nearby one that has been grazed to possibly better truth the modeling that has been done. Honestly, that was a recommendation out of this project. Not just because I want to go out there and set things on fire, but because I think for science's sake, we have to. So that's kind of the next component of this. What was the response to the pilots from recreational land users and neighbors in proximity? So that's a really good question because, of course, for us to get any sort of value to the community from the targeted grazing treatments, they have to be located right next to the community. This was quite easy to do in Cranbrook, where there's more, I think, it's a little bit more rural. And then our rancher partners there had amazing, excellent relationships with their nearby neighbors. And actually, because we were containing the animals to this certain area right next to the community for the Cranbrook East pilot, there was a request put out by our rancher partner for, could I hook up a water trough to water? And the people were so excited about it that one lady just actually put out a garden trough and filled it up with water and without even asking. She was just so excited to be able to support the cows, and a lot of people really like seeing animals close to home. You don't get to see livestock all that often unless you're engaged with them. The Southeast Kelowna site was a little bit more difficult because it was applied over an area that had significant recreational use. And so we put in a perimeter fence for the area, and also put in 18 gates to allow lots of recreational use. There was lots of signage, lots of community outreach. There was pushback initially. People were a little bit hesitant and apprehensive to have cattle that close to their homes or to be in areas where they're recreating. But they did really, again, at the end of the first year, there were no cattle that escaped. There were no issues. So there was a lot more support of it. But yeah, it is really important to create those partnerships and to communicate effectively. Phil, I'm not familiar with the fuel model you mentioned. Why that threshold in expected fire behavior at 95% herbaceous fuel moisture seems arbitrary. I'm not quite following. I'll look back at that. Oh, so that was just where the model found that the fire behavior dropped significantly was at 95% herbaceous fuel moisture. Moisture is a key driver in fire behavior.
So I have a question for you, Amanda.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about the role of forests in carbon sequestration as a climate change benefit. Have you thought about, obviously, if we can avoid these extreme wildfire events, we can retain more of the carbon on the landscape and sequester more carbon. Have you thought a bit about what you're proposing, use of grazing, et cetera, might mean in terms of carbon sequestration? Have you kind of worked those numbers through, or any thoughts about that?
So one of the differences in carbon storage between grasslands and I think this is what you were asking. One of the key differences in carbon sequestration between forests and grassland systems is in forests, it's mostly above ground. In grasslands, it's mostly below ground. So it's a very stable carbon way of storing carbon, especially in areas that are prone to fire. Because if a fire comes through, the majority of the carbon is still retained below ground in the soil. So what I've found through some of the research as a component of this project is that although forested systems may sequester a bit more carbon in absolute terms, grasslands still can still sequester a very significant amount of carbon, and it's far more stable. So I think that there's value in having both. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. But I guess I was thinking more of in terms of by reducing wildfire risk, you could even maintain perhaps more trees on a landscape as well over time by avoiding having these extreme wildfire events that wipe everything out kind of thing.
Oh, yes, absolutely. No, I think that's a really important consideration in this, is that if we can reduce those severe wildfires, then we're going to reduce the amount of carbon that's put out. And I can't recall exactly what the amount of carbon they estimated was released in those big 2017, 2018 fires, but these large scale severe fires result in more carbon release than any of like our transportation emissions or anything like that. So, within the context of climate change mitigation, I think it's a pretty key thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to ask, because in your pilot plots, you checked, you use the stocking density as a variable, like, for your experiments, and also the age of the animal. Now I'm asking, is there kind of any other, I'm just asking if there's any other variable you might have considered that you omitted in your pilot experiments. And also secondly, in terms of like the targeted grazing was for fire reduction. But from the data I collected is from between 2020 to 2022, I think. Does this targeted grazing kind of also what is the, if I should put it, what is the benefit does it have for the diversity? Like, I know the time frame is kind of short, but do you still have a program you might kind of continue monitoring for the diversity of the species on those plots?
Yes, so I'll answer your last question first. So it is short. Of course, monitoring for 3 seasons is not ideal. I'm a range ecologist. I think any monitoring less than 20 years doesn't give you enough information, because that's just how I was raised. But one of the good things that came out of this was 2020 was an incredibly wet year, and then 2021 was an incredible drought year. So we did kind of see the two polar opposite ends of of the different outcomes that can come from the targeted grazing treatment. And then further to that, there is the intention of retaining a little bit, some form of monitoring over these targeted grazing sites moving forward. But I think you're probably aware, like, CAP funding has come to an end. They're putting in new SCAP, and so the funding pieces have not yet been finalized for that. So the intention is, of course, yes, of continuing monitoring, especially with the level and caliber of the data that we have, is an objective, but we don't quite have the money in hand yet. And then your first question around the animal variables. So we didn't track anything aside from the stocking density and the types. We had cow-calf pairs and a couple of bulls. On one site, we used heifers. So we didn't track anything further than that. So we're just tracking sort of the grazing use. Was there anything else?
Like I was kind of thinking about maybe the animal health, like, sometimes you may have a density, but then maybe they're not kind of healthy, or maybe the times they may not be feeding well, like, that might also kind of, but I just kind of was thinking about it. But anyway, that's okay. Yeah.
No, I agree. And it would have been nice. So there weren't specific weight measurements taken before and after, but based on the feedback from the ranchers, they didn't see any additional value in like their animal gains from the targeted grazing treatments. So there wasn't any additional benefit to the ranchers from doing this. Unfortunately, there was some detriment around the death to toxic plants. So that's a really important one.
Yeah. Okay, any questions? I don't see any other question. Okay, thank you, Amanda, and thank you, our audience. I think with that, we come to the end of this session. I kind of want to express my gratitude to also our sponsors, the University of Southern British Columbia Geography, Earth and Environmental Science Department, the Pacific Climate Institute Consortium, and also the CMOS, which is the Canadian Meteorological and Oceanography Society. So thank you everyone for coming to this session, and we await further announcements of our next session. So thank you again, Amanda, and thank you all our audience. So with that,
Thank you.
goodbye.